Welcome to part 5 of our 6-part series of the study of the Book of Ecclesiastes. As we have noted in previous lessons, King Solomon is the author of this book. Along with the Book of Proverbs and the Song of Solomon, these three were penned by Solomon. This book is unique in itself, and perhaps as no other except for maybe the Book of Job in its depth of looking at the meaning and purpose of life and how God deals with us. The book in Ecclesiastes, in part, tells the story of Solomon's struggles to understand such things. We've noted before, as this is a compilation of a 31-part devotional series that was published prior to this. Each of these 6-part lessons contain 5 or 6 different devotionals. It is not an exhaustive study by any means. The study of the book of Ecclesiastes really could be a lifelong study in which each part of our life becomes a new facet of which we learn and discover in life. Last week we looked at chapters 7 and 8. We looked at the timeless themes of anger, the cost of being too wise, the inability to control the future or to know the future, crime and punishment, and the role of enjoyment plays in our daily lives. This week we shall continue with chapters 9 and 10. What happens after this life? The enjoyment of marriage, the uncertainty of life and the role that chance plays in it, and how a little folly can ruin a reputation, and the responsibility of rulers of a nation. I hope you will enjoy and learn from what Solomon, the inspired writer, penned for us all those years ago, and see how truly these lessons that Solomon penned 3,000 years ago are as applicable and relevant today as they were then. And now, let's begin our study today. Welcome to day 22 in our study of the Book of Ecclesiastes. The title of today's lesson is The Dead Know Nothing. Our passage comes from Ecclesiastes chapter 9. We'll be reading verses 1 through 6. But all this I laid to heart, examining it all, how the righteous and the wise and their deeds are in the hand of God. Whether it is love or hate, man does not know. Both are before him. It is the same for all, since the same event happens to the righteous and the wicked, to the good and the evil, to the clean and unclean, to him who sacrifices and him who does not sacrifice. As the good one is, so is the sinner, and he who swears is as he who shuns an oath. This is an evil in all that is done under the sun, that the same event happens to all. Also, the hearts of the children of man are full of evil, and madness is in their hearts while they live. And after that, they go to the dead. But he who is joined with all the living has hope. For a living dog is better than a dead lion. For the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing, and they have no more reward, for the memory of them is forgotten. Their love and their hate and their envy have already perished, and forever they have no more share in all that is done under the sun. I am thy father's spirit, doomed for a certain term to walk the night, and for the day confined to fast and fires, till the foul crimes done in my days of nature are burnt and purged away. But that I am forbid to tell the secrets of my prison house. I could tale unfold whose lightest word would harrow up thy soul, freeze thy young blood, make thy 2 eyes like stars start from their spheres, thy knotted and combined locks to part, and each particular hair to stand on end, like quills upon the fearful porpentine. But this eternal blazon must not be. To ears of flesh and blood, list, list, oh list, if thou didst ever thy dear father love. That is the famous scene from Hamlet, where the father's ghost appears to the son and eventually reveals that he was not bitten by a poisonous snake, but poisoned by his brother. It's a ghost story of epic proportions. As ancient as that story seems, being now over 400 years old, there are many tales of the crypt, older still. Pliny the Younger tells of his encounter in Athens in the 1st century of an old man rattling chains in his house. Lucian and Plautus, contemporaries of Pliny, also wrote of such encounters. Poltergeist from a farmhouse in the 9th century. Anne Boleyn, second wife of Henry VIII, appearing in the Tower of London where she was executed. Benjamin Franklin's ghost, sightings near the Library of American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And the sightings of Abraham Lincoln in the White House in Washington, D.C. We love our ghost stories. Beyond those historical ghosts listed above, we are inundated with such tales of the dead. Cities around the world offer ghost tours with wild claims of the dead haunting the halls of old houses. Classic novels, the likes of Henry James' The Turn of the Screw, or Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings with his Dead Men of Dunharrow, Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol with the Three Ghosts of Christmas. And let's not forget about movies. The Ghost and Mrs. Muir, Ghostbusters, Field of Dreams, The Amityville Horror, The Sixth Sense, and Ghost, among the many, many, many others. All works of fiction, brought to us by the wild imaginations of their authors. Where will you find these works if you search in a library? Under fiction. Any creative work portraying people, events, places in imaginary ways that are not strictly based on history or fact. That's the definition of fiction from the Oxford Dictionary. The world, it seems, is obsessed by the occult, defined as those matters regarded as involving the action or supernatural or supernormal power or some secret knowledge of them. We are quite sure we have seen, heard, or sensed a ghost about us. A door slams in an empty room, a creaky hinge, an image that appears in our peripheral vision for an instant, a long-lost relative we think is speaking to us in a dream. The reality is, we are highly susceptible to such suggestible things. Me? I've never once heard anything that goes bump in the night. But that doesn't prove anything. But I do believe that if a person is looking for those types of things, their minds will produce them. Call me a skeptic, but I'm with those Missouri people. You got to show me. And to date, I just haven't seen anything beyond very imaginative productions of the mind. Is that what we have here in Ecclesiastes 9, a proof text for the non-existence of ghosts? While some may see it that way, the overarching theme of this passage is the idea that Solomon has been chipping away at from the very outset. The finite nature of this life that we live. So, to lift this phrase from our passage today and say that with certainty that this is what it means is not a good exegetical strategy. But what does Solomon mean when he says, the dead know nothing? Is he saying that they no longer exist and their spirit or soul has vanished? No. Remember, there is a good practice as to how to approach a passage, a verse, or a phrase in Scripture. It's been called the ABC method by some. And 3 questions to ask that will help clarify a passage. A, what is above that passage? That is, what has been written just prior to it. B, what is below this passage? What's written immediately after this passage? And C, what is the context of this passage? What's the author writing about in general? For the Christian, this idea that the dead know nothing is not a doctrinal declaration from Solomon. Even Jesus himself declared that in Matthew chapter 22 and verse 32. I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. And his parable of Lazarus and the rich man certainly teaches us of a consciousness of souls after death. Luke 16:23-24. And in Hades, being in torment, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham far off and Lazarus at his side. And he called out, Father Abraham, have mercy on me and send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in anguish in this flame. Oh yes, the rich man understood much, as did those souls beneath the altar in the highly figurative book of Revelation. In Revelation chapter 6, verses 9 and 10, we read, When he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the witness they had borne. They cried out with a loud voice, O sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long before you will judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? So, what is Solomon saying? Exactly what he has been saying all along. Don't get lost in this wise man's thesis. Although he seems to be espousing what the vain philosophies of the world have in their hopelessness declare, Solomon's grand finale will set it all in order. He is saying precisely what the writer of Hebrews will say 1,000 years from then in Hebrews 9:27. And just as it has been appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment. The world would have us believe that is those who believe in the ghosts and such, that the dead roam the halls and hills and hollows in various and sundry ways, making amends and awaiting their ultimate fate. But don't believe those old fairy tales. They're just tales told, as Shakespeare, not Hamlet's ghost, says. Ultimately, this life is what we are given. When it is completed, our fate is sealed, for better or for worse. The dead don't continue to work and labor. That living dog that Solomon talks about still has a chance, so to speak, to make changes, but not the dead lion. His time here has ceased. He has no more reward, as it says in verse 5. They who die have no more share in all that is done under the sun here on earth. The moral of the story? It is so plain as to be shouting from the pages. This life is a gift from God in all its splendor, in all its pain, and everything in between. Live it accordingly. The life that awaits us after is dependent upon it. Have you lived your life to the fullest for God? And Lord willing, let's meet here again tomorrow for another lesson in the book of Ecclesiastes. Welcome to day 23 in our study of the book of Ecclesiastes. The title for today's lesson is Enjoy Life with the Wife Whom You Love. Our verses will come from Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verses 7 through 10. Go, eat your bread with joy, drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already approved what you do. Let your garments be always white. Let not oil be lacking on your head. Enjoy life with the wife whom you love, all the days of your vain life that he has given you under the sun, because that is your portion in life, and in your toil at which you toil under the sun. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might, for there is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol, to which you are going. Okay, you've finished your meal at the Chinese restaurant. Buffet style, of course. Now comes the moment you've been waiting for. No, not the bill. Even better, the fortune cookie. What is your future? It might read, nothing is so much to be feared as fear. Or maybe it says, all things are difficult before they are easy. Or even this one, the real kindness comes from within you. Yes, it all makes sense now. You fold it neatly and put it in your pocket and proceed to forget all about it until it is laundry time. And then it becomes part of next week's garbage. However, every time I eat at a Chinese restaurant, again, buffet style, of course, I get the same fortune. Help! I'm a prisoner in a fortune cookie factory. Maybe you'll get the one that says, the fortune you seek is in another cookie. Or maybe you're about to become $10.95 poor, $8.95 if you had the buffet. Or maybe one that simply said, run! Or finally, ignore previous cookie. Funny how we seem to be looking for our good fortune in so many places, except where life really is. The gambler looks for his numbers to come up. Ah, yes, I'm on 12th Street and I stop to let a family of ducks go across. Then I'm on Highway 8 and a deer runs across and I miss it. Those must be my lucky numbers for today. I'll put my money on number 12 in the 8th race. Maddening! A young boy twists the stem for his apple, moving up the alphabet with each twist until it breaks off on the letter G. He is assured that his true love's name will begin with that letter. Insufferable! Another finds a penny on the ground and concludes it is lucky and makes up her mind that it must be her lucky day. Outrageous! Is that what this life has been reduced to? Whims and fancies and lucky charms? Our verses today are really a continuation of the previous passages from verses 1 to 6. I suppose that could be said of the entirety of the book of Ecclesiastes to one extent or another. All of Solomon's thoughts are, as it were, a stream of consciousness about what he has seen and what he has been saying all along. What I have seen under the sun. Remember what he means when he says under the sun is that which is done here in this life. And don't lose sight of that. It's important to know. Remember also the context of what Solomon says, lest we go off on tangents and extremes. A good example of this is the admonition in verse 7 to drink your wine with a merry heart. Now, Solomon is not advocating a lifestyle of drinking booze. He's warned about that, not only here in Ecclesiastes chapter 2 and verse 3, but also in Proverbs chapter 20 and verse 1, and chapter 31 and verses 4 through 5. Look it up and you'll see. But glance back now to verse 1 of this chapter to understand who Solomon is directing this towards. We read, "But all this I laid to heart, examining it all, how the righteous and the wise and their deeds are in the hand of God. Whether it is love or hate, man does not know. Both are before him." Yes, there it is. He's writing to the righteous and the wise. Now, what Solomon says in verse 7 makes perfect sense. "Go, eat your bread with joy and drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already approved what you do." Solomon is now headed for the finish line, as they say. Tempered with the idea of pleasing God is the idea that this life is meant to be enjoyed. For so he emulates this when he says in verse 8 of chapter 9, "Let your garments be always white. Let not oil be lacking from your head." Consider what Joab said to the wise woman of Tekoa. In 2 Samuel chapter 14 and verse 2 we read, "And Joab sent to Tekoa and brought from there a wise woman and said to her, 'Pretend to be a mourner and put on mourning garments. Do not anoint yourself with oil, but behave like a woman who has been mourning many days for the dead.'" Solomon's saying, don't go about as a mourner. Put on a festive color of white and anoint yourself with the gladness of oil. We might recall what Jesus said of this as well in Matthew chapter 6, verses 16 through 18 in his Sermon on the Mount. "And when you fast, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces, that their fasting may be seen by others. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, that your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who is in secret. Your Father who sees in secret will reward you." Many have been troubled by verse 9, but only because it is Solomon who spoke it. Enjoy life with the wife whom you love, all the days of your vain life that he has given you under the sun, because that is your portion in life and in your toil at which you toil under the sun. In light of what was written about him in 1 Kings chapter 11, that has some validity. For we read, He had 700 wives who were princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. Still, we must see this in the light of an older and wiser Solomon, who is reflecting back on his life of vanity and wanton pleasure, and now sees the error of his ways. He addresses us earlier in the book when he says in chapter 2 and verses 8 through 10, I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delight of the sons of man. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also, my wisdom remained with me, and whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. Such are the desires of youth, which the Apostle Paul warns Timothy of in 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 22. So flee youthful passions and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace, along with those who call on the Lord from a pure heart. It is interesting that Paul gives instructions as to the qualifications of an elder or shepherd of the flock of the New Testament, and gives these commands concerning youth and marriage. In 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 2, he writes, Therefore an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach. And further he adds in verse 6 of that passage, he must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. Though Solomon didn't follow his own advice, it is nonetheless prudent and wise to remember what he often gave as sage advice when it came to marriage. For we read in Proverbs chapter 5, verses 15 through 20. Drink water from your own cistern, flowing water from your own well. Should your springs be scattered abroad, streams of water in the streets? Let them be for yourself alone, and not for strangers with you. Let your fountain be blessed, and rejoice in the wife of your youth, a lovely deer, a graceful doe. Let her breasts fill you at all times with delight. Be intoxicated always in her love. Why should you be intoxicated, my son, with a forbidden woman, and embrace the bosom of an adulteress? Have you given all your might toward your marriage? And Lord willing, let's meet here again tomorrow for another lesson in a study in the book of Ecclesiastes. Welcome to day 24 in our study of the book of Ecclesiastes. Today's lesson is entitled, Time and Chance Happen to Them All. Our verses today come from Ecclesiastes chapter 9. We'll be reading verses 11 through 18. Again I saw that under the sun the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to the intelligent, nor favor to those with knowledge. But time and chance happen to them all. For man does not know his time, like fish that are taken in an evil net, like birds that are caught in a snare. So the children of man are snared at an evil time, when it suddenly falls upon them. I have also seen this example of wisdom under the sun, and it seemed great to me. There was a little city with few men in it, and a great king came against it and besieged it, building great siege works against it. But there was found in it a poor, wise man, and he, by his wisdom, delivered the city. Yet no one remembered that poor man. But I say that wisdom is better than might, though the poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words are not heard. The words of the wise heard in quiet are better than the shouting of a ruler among fools. Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good. One of the more fascinating studies in recent history is that of twins. Geneticists have a keen interest in these because of the shared genes. In identical twins, known as monozygotic, they share all the genes, while in fraternal twins, dizygotic, they share only 50% of the genes. Of special interest are the traits passed down in the susceptibility to diseases. For instance, in cases where a twin gets Parkinson's disease, 89% of the time, the other twin will not be affected in identical twins, and even less in fraternal twins. In other cases of identical twins, a noticeable increase in rates of schizophrenia were found over those of the general population. Geneticists and researchers share a common interest in these studies as it can help in understanding the difference in the role of genetics and environmental impacts. What is perhaps even more fascinating is the research done on twins who have been separated from birth. The Minnesota Twins family study, not to be confused with the baseball team, begun in 1987 and has yielded some remarkable results. Elizabeth Hamill and Ann Hunt spent 78 years apart, separated from birth. One lived in Oregon in the United States and the other in the United Kingdom. Both Elizabeth and Ann were widowed, each having been married to a man named Jim. Both were religious. A little unusual, you'll have to admit. Now, if you really want an odd one, consider these triplets that were separated at birth, featured in the 2018 documentary, Three Identical Strangers. Three brothers were reunited 19 years after birth. Two of the brothers were enrolled in a New York college and were often mistaken for each other, unbeknownst to each other until they were introduced. Then brother number 3 contacted them when he realized he was a sibling as well. What is more unusual are their mannerisms. They sit the same way. All were wrestlers. They liked the same colors. All smoked the same cigarettes. Each had an adopted sister that were coincidentally the same age. There is a sad part to this. The mother knowingly gave up these triplets so that they could be researched over the years. These studies lend themselves to those who desire to know the influence of nature versus nurture as it pertains to which is greater. Is it the genetics that play a greater role in the development of a child, or is it the environment that they are raised in? That debate is, I'm quite sure, going to continue on for some time. There is one other factor that plays a role to a lesser or greater degree that is not often mentioned in these discussions. It is that of chance. These variables are perhaps the wildest of the unpredictable. Consider, a child has good genes and a stable home environment. But there are also probabilities that simply cannot be calculated into this equation. A child contracts a disease from another child that keeps it home, and in the meantime, the school bus the child would normally ride is in an accident that kills all the children. In another, a child is hit in the eye by an object and loses sight in that eye, greatly altering its life. On and on it goes as to things that might happen that will have a profound effect on their lives. Solomon adds factors into this complex book: time and chance. He says this happens to all. How can one quantify such things? Solomon has approached this conflict before. We read in Ecclesiastes chapter 2 and verses 14 and 15, "The wise person has his eyes in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And yet I perceive that the same event happens to all of them. Then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? And I said in my heart that this also is vanity." We may think, as would be reasonable, that the race does go to the swifter runner. After all, the law of physics demands that. If I run faster than the other, then I, by definition, will travel the same distance quicker and thus will win. There are laws and reasoning that govern each of those that Solomon follows with. Nor the battle to the strong, bread to the wise, riches to the intelligent, or favor to those with knowledge. But there is always chance, or what some call luck, in these equations. The swifter one might fall. The strong may have the sun in his eyes. The wise may have to contend with a famine. The intelligent one may be too lazy. Who knows why the knowledgeable one cannot find favor? Therein lies the fallacy of human reasoning. We may look back at the wisdom and providence of God in putting Joseph in Egypt amid the perils and all he went through, and then realize he was put there to save the race of people called to take forth the lineage of the Messiah one day. The little girl in Israel taken prisoner so that one day she might tell Naaman about the prophet in Israel who can heal him. 4 young men of noble birth taken into exile and one day become leaders under the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. That which Solomon and we so often call chance, or worse, bad luck, God has a way of working his providential care into our lives. Paul tells us in Romans chapter 8, beginning in verse 25, "But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. For we do not know what to pray for as we ought, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. And he who searches hearts knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. And those whom he predestined, he also called. And those whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified." Yet Solomon also declares that even such things are not perceived or appreciated at the time. In verses 14 and 15 of our chapter today, "There was a little city with few men in it, and a great king came against it and besieged it, building great siege works against it. But there was found in it a poor wise man, and he, by his wisdom, delivered the city. Yet no one remembered that poor man." Was that not the case with Joseph in prison? We read in Genesis chapter 40, verses 12 through 14. "Then Joseph said to him, 'This is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hands as formerly, when you were his cupbearer. Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness of mentioning me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house.'" But note what happens later in verse 23 of that chapter. "Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him." Was this not how Christ was treated in his hometown in Matthew chapter 13, verses 53 through 57? "And when Jesus had finished these parables, he went away from there, and coming to his hometown, he taught them in a synagogue, so that they were astonished and said, 'Where did this man get this wisdom and these mighty works? Is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? And are not his brothers James and Joseph and Simon and Judas? And are not all his sisters with us? Where then did this man get all these things?' And they took offense at him. But Jesus said to them, 'A prophet is not without honor except in his hometown and in his own household.'" Of a truth, Solomon surely did declare in verses 16 through 18, "But I say that wisdom is better than might, though the poor man's wisdom is despised and his words are not heard. The words of the wise heard in quiet are better than the shouting of a ruler among fools. Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good." Now Solomon is in full force, and by wisdom begins to extol wisdom for its virtues, and from here on out will enlighten the reader with it. Are you able to take hold of wisdom's promise and seek it for all it's worth? Can you overcome your nature and environment and become wise? And Lord willing, let's meet here again tomorrow for another lesson from the Book of Ecclesiastes. Welcome to day 25 of our study of the Book of Ecclesiastes. Our title for today's lesson is Dead Flies Make the Perfumer's Ointment Give Off a Stench. Our verses for today come from Ecclesiastes chapter 10. We'll be reading verses 1 through 15. Dead flies make the perfumer's ointment give off a stench, so a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. A wise man's heart inclines him to the right, but a fool's heart to the left. Even when the fool walks on the road, he lacks sense. He says to everyone that he is a fool. If the anger of the ruler rises against you, do not leave your place, for calmness will lay great offenses to rest. There is an evil that I have seen under the sun, as it were an error proceeding from the ruler. Folly is set in many high places, and the rich sit in a low place. I have seen slaves on horses, and princes walking on the ground like slaves. He who digs a pit will fall into it, and a serpent will bite him who breaks through a wall. He who quarries stones is hurt by them, and he who splits logs is endangered by them. If the iron is blunt and one does not sharpen the edge, he must use more strength, but wisdom helps one to succeed. If the serpent bites before it is charmed, there is no advantage to the charmer. The words of a wise man's mouth win him favor, but the lips of a fool consumes him. The beginning of the words of his mouth is foolishness, and the end of his talk is evil madness. A fool multiplies words, though no man knows what is to be, and who can tell him what will be after him? The toil of a fool wearies him, for he does not know the way to the city. I fancy myself as somewhat of a handyman when it comes to home repairs. I don't like that information to get out, or people will call me to fix things for them. I'm just going to stop right there, because the reality is I'm really not that good. My bathtub faucet drips constantly. Some of the doors of my house don't close all that well. My snowblower doesn't work. I could go on, but the point I want to make is I like to have a well-stocked toolkit in spite of the fact that I don't use them. When I see a multi-tool with lots of features at a good price, I start to drool a little bit. Screwdrivers with replaceable bit inserts. I have a tool bucket in a box that I like to keep well-stocked with all manner of tools so that I have everything I need on the job. Doodads and whatchamacallits and thingamabobs, you name it, it's all in there. However, my favorite tool is the Swiss Army knife. It not only has a knife blade, but a file, screwdrivers, leather punch, saw blade, a teeny tiny pair of scissors, and tweezers. And for good measure, a plastic toothpick. But there is the Swiss Army knife to beat all Swiss Army knives, and multi-tools for that matter. It is the Wenger Giant. It boasts 87 implements and has 141 functions. It's 9 inches in width and weighs in at a mere 32 ounces. Now that's compared to the average Swiss Army knife, which is about 1.5 ounces. It has a nail file, corkscrew, pliers, a chain rivet setter, Allen wrench, a can opener, a divot replacer when you go golfing, a compass, a telescopic pointer, mineral crystal magnifier, a tire thread gauge, and a wire stripper, among others. And for good measure, tweezers and a toothpick. It holds the world's record for the largest multi-tool. Will I ever use all those tools? I rather doubt it, but they are there, nevertheless, just in case I need them. Do I need every tool in my handyman's bucket and toolbox on every job? Nope, but I have them just in case. Now for a moment, let's consider the works of Solomon, and if you will, picture them as your toolbox for life. We read in 1 Kings chapter 4 and verse 32, he also spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. Of those 3,000 proverbs he spoke, less than one-third are preserved in the book known as Proverbs. By some estimations, only about 923. While some don't consider Ecclesiastes strictly a book of Proverbs, Solomon nonetheless gives wise sayings. Enough so that a person can be consumed with his works for a lifetime and still find themselves wanting in the end. Matthew Henry, the biblical scholar, says of him, Solomon was herein a type of Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasure of wisdom and knowledge, and hidden for use, for he is made of God to us wisdom. Solomon in chapter 10 begins to set forth jewels of wisdom for our contemplation. As he so often did in the book of Proverbs, he lays wisdom beside folly for our consideration. The same way a jeweler lays a precious diamond on black velvet cloth and shines a light upon it to show the brilliance of every facet. Here, layer upon layer is peeled back for us to view the inner workings of wisdom, knowledge, and discretion here in chapter 10. The simple person would not know or realize that the vastly expensive nard is ruined by the dead fly. Yet, if that naive person takes the time to query the perfumer, he indeed discovers the truth, and therein can see the truth that Solomon has laid bare to observe that wisdom and honor, yes, a good reputation, is indeed ruined with but a little folly. After all, it was only a moment's weakness that cast Adam and Eve from the garden. And so it was a moment's lapse of judgment that kept Moses out of the promised land. The subtlety of the use of the right hand and the left to portray the wise man's heart and the heart of the fool. For so Scripture portrays the right hand as that of strength and good, and the left as weakness and evil. Search for yourself to see that indeed in Mark chapter 16, verse 19. So then the Lord Jesus, after he had spoken to them, was taken up into heaven and sat down at the right hand of God, the side of power. Yes, a fool's folly is so often seen in the way they conduct themselves, as Solomon says in verse 3, even when he walks on the road. For the writer of Hebrews tells us in Hebrews 5:14, solid food is for the mature, for those who have their powers of discernment, trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil. How does one come to distinguish the wise from the foolish? Constant practice and observing that what Solomon the wise proclaimed. Listen to their talk, as he says in Proverbs 18, verses 6 through 7. A fool's lips walk into a fight, and his mouth invites a beating. A fool's mouth is his ruin, and his lips are a snare to his soul. See if they listen before they talk, for we read in Proverbs 18:13. If one gives an answer before he hears, it is his folly and shame. Are they given to anger and violence? We read in Proverbs 22, beginning in verse 24. Make no friendship with a man given to anger, nor go with a wrathful man, lest you learn his ways and entangle yourself in a snare. Wisdom also teaches one how to deal with those in high places. We read in verse 4, and also in Proverbs 25:15, with patience a ruler may be persuaded, and a soft tongue will break a bone. And again in Proverbs 16, verse 13, righteous lips are the delight of a king, and he loves him who speaks what is right. A king's wrath is a messenger of death, and a wise man will appease it. Knowing these are truths, one is able to rightly observe life around them, as Solomon shows them and us. Continue with verse 5 here in Ecclesiastes 10, onward and see the things Solomon observed. See them through his eyes. See them with wisdom. Then you will observe life not judgmentally or with prejudice, but with wisdom, and be counted among the wise. So it is with all of Scripture that gives wisdom. Consider what James tells us by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit in James chapter 1, verses 5 and 6. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. But let him ask in faith, with no doubting. For the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. Have you been collecting those tools for your toolbox of life? And Lord willing, let's meet here again tomorrow for another lesson from the Book of Ecclesiastes. Well, there you have it for this study. I hope you'll join us again next time as we continue in our study of this most fascinating of books, Ecclesiastes. And may God bless you in your search for truth and wisdom in His Word, the Bible. And Lord willing, we'll see you here again.